Okay, I hear we are live. So that's my signal to get started. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us for this 15th episode in our series, Innovation and Biotech in the Time of COVID-19. My name is Johannes Frühhoff. I'm the founder and president at Lab Central, and I'm hosting this seminar series here for us, where we're trying to rebuild a little bit the exchange and communication with leaders in our field and peers while we are sort of distant from each other. I'm thrilled to be joined today by two fantastic panelists and friends who are going to talk with us about their entrepreneurial journey. And sort of first, I want to welcome Dr. Nina Dudnik, and who is the founder of former founder and former CEO of Seeding Labs. And she'll tell us all about that. Now, Nina works at Sigma, which is one of our sponsors, and helps them figure out their government affairs. I'm also thrilled to be joined by Ulrich Nielsen, who is one of our Lab Central-based entrepreneurs, founder of Tidal Therapeutics, and previously Torque, which both of them he built here at Lab Central. And then before that, a number of other companies, notably among them Merrimack Pharmaceuticals, where he actually has the achievement of having an approved drug to his name, Onivide, which is used in pancreatic cancer. So that's an achievement that few of us ever get to, but we all strive to work towards. So thank you for both of you, to both of you for being part of our panel today. And I'd like to kick it off so our topic today is the entrepreneurial journey. And so we chose this topic because many of our founders at Lab Central are just like you. They are trained as scientists, don't have much of a business degree, and they end up starting companies. Sometimes it goes well, sometimes it goes badly. In all cases, they can benefit from learning from people like yourselves and hearing your experience and the advice that you can share with them. We want to touch upon topics that have to do with personal work-life balance, as well as structural, such as boards, and all of the above. Maybe we can start off with you, Nina, asking you to tell us a little bit the story of how you started Seeding Labs when you were just a freshly minted young PhD from Harvard. Nina.
Thanks, Johannes. I was not one of these people who sort of said, I'm going to be an entrepreneur and set off to look for an idea. And in fact, I had been running Seeding Labs for several years before it ever even occurred to me that it could actually be my job. I was a scientist. I decided I was going to be a scientist probably when I was around 8 years old, and very definitively when I was 13, decided I was going to be a geneticist and I was going to feed the world. And this is very heavily influenced by my teacher assigned us to read the newspaper for a week and find articles about science. And the Chicago Tribune, my hometown newspaper, happened to be running a series of articles about this very futuristic genetic engineering, and some of it was around agriculture and some of the really early GMO foods that were just about to be commercialized. And I thought that this was the most extraordinary thing I had ever heard of in my life. I'd not learned anything about this yet in school. And I was really fired up around this idea, not just about the science of it, but the sort of humanitarian potential inherent in it. Somehow at this very young age, I started to sort of have these grand visions of how we were going to feed the world through this new science. And that carried me really far. So that carried me all the way through high school, carried me all the way through undergrad. My first jobs out of undergrad were all in international agriculture. I ended up living abroad for several years in Europe and in Africa, working in agricultural research stations and NGOs. And it was an extraordinary set of experiences. I got to do all kinds of amazing things, including working in a very new, very tiny biotech lab in West Africa, where we were doing things like reusing microtubes and washing them and autoclaving them and reusing them for weeks and weeks and weeks at a time. And straight from that lab, after a year in a lab like that, I came back to Boston and did the thing that you're supposed to do, right? Which is to get on the science track, right? Any of us who've been in science know there's a track, right? You get your PhD, you do a postdoc, and forever after. And so I came back to do my postdoc, enrolled at Harvard, and just entered this incredibly deep culture shock, having these incredible resources at my disposal to do science. And Seeding Labs grew out of that experience. And so really, while I was in graduate school, the early foundations of Seeding Labs started to take shape as a grassroots, volunteer operation that I was running out of the basement of the university, somewhat unbeknownst to the administration of the university. And it was really around this mission, having sort of seen firsthand and even a little bit lived the experience of being a scientist elsewhere in the world, to bridge that gap in very concrete and specific ways. And it was only after several years of doing that a friend of mine suggested that I enter MIT's business plan competition, the 100K. And I at first looked at him in total disbelief. I had no idea what he was talking about, because I obviously wasn't running a business. I had no idea what he was talking about. And that was a huge turning point for me. And Seeding Labs was born shortly thereafter, more formally.
You really started with the mission and the desire to fix this problem that has to do with equipping labs around the world so that they can do science. You didn't start with sort of the business idea in mind. I think that's right. That's in many cases the founding spark in scientifically founded companies. Ulrich, can we ask you about the genesis, or how did you make the transition from an academic? I know you trained in Denmark and also did a postdoc at MIT. When did you know that you were going to no longer pursue the purely academic career and instead went out and started your first company? How did that come about?
You know what, I think I knew that even before I went to grad school. I grew up in a home with my dad was an executive in a very corporate role. And at some point he started spinning companies from that corporation. And at some point he left the company to join one of them. It always fascinated me. I didn't really understand exactly what he was doing, but he was in biotech and it sounded really cool. Long story short, I had an opportunity to come to the US to do my PhD in San Francisco. And this was in the late 90s. Everyone around me was working in a startup or starting one. It was truly a bubble, but it was real fun to be there. A couple of years into grad school, I wrote a business plan, presented it to my professor, and I thought we should do it. He didn't jump on it. He'd never started a business. I certainly never had, but it was a fun experience. Meanwhile, I've been collaborating with a group at MIT who wanted to start a company, which is what later became Merrimack. So actually, before I even graduated, I packed my suitcases and came out to MIT to help work on this business. It was a lot of fun. I did a postdoc that essentially consisted of writing a paper, writing a business plan, filing some patents, and doing venture pitches. It was my dream come true. And that became Merrimack. I left it, co-founded Merrimack with a handful of professors from Harvard and MIT, but was pretty much left to my own pretty quickly there in my late 20s to have to build an R&D organization and get some therapeutic programs off the ground. And it probably took a lot longer than you could get away with today. But eventually we did. And it was a lot of fun. We ended up launching more than half a dozen drugs into clinical development, maybe a few more than we should have, but it became crazy expensive over time. We got to build a full manufacturing organization in-house and a lot of other really cool things. So that was what launched me into business. I've never looked back. At one point, I was very eager to get a formal business education. And this was one of those pivotal moments in my career where I sat down with the CEO of Merrimack, who's a dear friend of mine also. And I asked him about it. And he was like, of course, he was a little bit torn because he didn't want me to leave to go to business school. But he told me, you know what, the best business degree you can get is to make Merrimack successful. And after that, you won't need any letters after your name. So I didn't end up going to business school, although I later did some executive education at Harvard Business School, which was a ton of fun, but it was much better doing the context of starting a business. And that had launched me into, fundraising and building, strategies, et cetera, around companies.
Yeah, I think that's such a key point, right? Is, do you need or don't you need the formal education? I am somewhat biased. I won't contaminate the discussion with my own view, but that certainly does. That is certainly a question that many of our founders ask themselves. Should they take a break and from running their business and go to business school to learn the formal things that nobody told them about while they were 5 years, 7 years into their scientific training, or even 20 years into their scientific training, which is sort of very singular minded, as Nina mentioned, on the science. Nina, how did you go about finding support? Obviously, now you were solving problems that no one had taught you about when you were shipping lab equipment to overseas recipients. And you had to somehow pay for it and make the numbers work and somehow create a business, even though it became a non-profit business, but a business no less that has to be sustainable, that has to have income to pay for its costs, right? And so how do you advise founders go about that? If they know, like in your case, you were very mission driven. You knew the problem you wanted to solve, but you don't really have the business tools. I don't know if someone taught you to read a budget or a P&L before. So how do you go about assembling the team that can help you make this idea successful?
Yeah, I'm also biased, right? I don't have an MBA. And my bias includes, I really genuinely think there are a lot of things about being a scientist that prepare you well to do this. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, right, especially doing a PhD, what do you learn how to do? You learn how to teach yourself whatever you need to know in the moment that you need to know it for as long as it's required, right? And then you can forget it if you don't need it anymore. And that's all you do for years and years and years as a scientist. And you have quantitative skills, you know how to, right? I think a lot of what I found was that a lot of it was vocabulary. There was a vocabulary gap more than anything else. And my strategy was to try to be as clear-eyed as possible about what I didn't know and not really get hung up on it, on admitting that I didn't know it. And then Boston in particular is an amazing place to be able to cull people from all over the place. So I did everything possible, right? So I remember very vividly being at some kind of lunchtime seminar and overhearing that the person next to me was an accountant and immediately buttonholing her and saying, can I hire you for some number of hours, as many as I could afford, to teach me how to use QuickBooks and do accounting? Because I also, right, I was a CEO, I was also the CFO, right? And so, by sort of accumulating people who could help me with specific aspects of what I needed to learn, that was a lot of it. I ran in global supply chain and I didn't even know that phrase when I started it out, but it's all learnable. And that's, I think, the most important skill that you come in with as a scientist is knowing how to learn.
I think it's also important. You mentioned how Boston is a great environment to learn new skills and to maybe develop this entrepreneurial skill, because there are many people who can give you advice. I always am interested to find out how people go about building their network and build, like you mentioned that you met this woman who helped you with the finances. Is there a strategy that you would recommend to scientific founders? What are the things they ought to think about in the team that they're assembling around them? Maybe this is a follow-up for Nina, but let's pitch it to Ulrich. Ulrich, when you now you're a serial entrepreneur, you've done this more than once. In fact, you've done that many times now, and so I expect that it does get easier over time. How would you recommend for first-time founders to think about building their first team? Should they hire their friends? That makes it easy to communicate with them. What are some of the risks inherent in that, or what other strategies should they think about when they build their first team around themselves?
Yeah, look, that initial team that you put around a startup is incredibly important. And what I've found over and over is that that's a team you're able to hire some of the best people into that you'll ever find. And I think it's because it's self-selective. It's finding people who are willing to take risk, who have a deep enough understanding that they dare to jump onto this, very often without, even having any funding in place. Most of the people that joined both Toric and now Tidal, when they came on board, I didn't know how I was going to pay them, but I, sort of gave them a letter of employment saying start, after our closing, kind of thing. But those people turn out to just always be exceptional. And you've seen some of those people around those companies working with me. They've done exceptionally well, not just in the companies that I was part of, but in the companies where they ended up working later. And actually, that's been one of the joys of being in Cambridge for so many years, is seeing many of those people sort of flourish and now being executives or entrepreneurs themselves around town. The other thing that I think is really critical to your success, not only do you hire people that really can challenge you and probably do a better job than you, but you also want to find stakeholders, for instance, investors that are going to challenge you. And the first serious company I funded was Toric, right? Where we had Flagship as an investor. And they literally come in with unreasonable expectations, right? And they'll tell you that, and they'll hold you to it, and continue to beat you up, year after year. And that's how you continue to also, grow in your leadership, and also make sure you bring in really good people, because otherwise you just can't pull it off.
So if you look at this sort of very formal structure that develops when you bring in VCs, you probably, most founders don't really have much of a choice because they really need the money, right? So they have to take the money that's on the table. And oftentimes that comes with certain strings attached. If you have a choice of different investor groups, now I imagine that you, Ulrich, are in a position to have that to some extent. What are you looking for in investors, and what are you looking for in board members? And I'm going to ask the same question of you, Nina. Like how do you think about sort of building that senior support? Maybe now not the team of employees, but really sort of the board and the senior advisors that you're bringing in. Ulrich, to the extent that you have a choice of investors and board members, what are you looking for?
Yeah, I mean, this is wisdom that comes, mostly in hindsight, right? But I think with hindsight, I think that the best investors you can get on board are the ones that really understand what you're trying to do, and that have a track records of doing things out of the ordinary. Yeah, at least it depends a little bit on the type of business you're trying to build, but I've always been drawn to technology companies, taking new technologies, bringing them into the world, and turning them into products, not really knowing what those products are going to look like necessarily ahead of time. And that's where you need investors and board members who dare to sort of suspend that and leave something to be figured out later, and have the confidence that you're going to do something exceptional nonetheless. And so you want to look for people who have that kind of mindset, have that kind of track record, and then also have deep pockets. One of my mentors once told me that the best investor is one that has so much cash that they can afford to lose it. And there's some truth to that, right? I mean, you don't want to be a ginormous part of their portfolio or their investment, so they can also dare to think of you as, part of their portfolio and take chances with you. Yeah.
Give you some rope without controlling you too tightly. Nina, I know that you have, when you were running seeding labs, that you built a board and you picked board members. I expect that they also turn over. What are some of the learnings there? What are you looking for as you are assembling that group of people to work with?
Yeah, the board evolved so dramatically over the decade plus that I was running Seeding Labs. Because when you start, it's a little bit like, you alluded to how do you pick your first team? And, it's this mix of being incredibly strategic and being totally desperate, right? And so you land somewhere in the middle. And, but what I always tried to do was fill the gaps, right? So like I said, I was, very clear-eyed about what I did and didn't know and what network I did and didn't have. And so with the board in particular, it was always about filling in skill sets and networks that the organization needed that wasn't in-house, right? So as the team grew, that got even sort of easier to identify, but it was always sort of, what are the skills? Which ones do we need in-house? Which ones can be, supplanted by the board? And in particular, I think, for an organization that's structured as a nonprofit, the board is your external ambassadorship in a really different way. And so how do you tap into the stakeholder groups that you absolutely need to be successful? A lot of that ends up being sort of who's on your board and who are they connected to. And that changed a lot, though, from the beginning, right? Really early on, I was literally the sole employee of Seeding Labs for the first year plus. The board was the staff in many ways, right? And by the time the organization grew, after a couple of years, even after about a year, that the organization outgrew that board. And it was really, the board was very clear about that too. So I had board members coming to me saying, I think you don't need me on the board anymore, right? And so it evolved very dramatically from a very hands-on, all working board to a much more of an advisory and ambassadorship kind of a board.
And of course, that's not unlike some of the boards that we have in seed-funded companies as they progress. The board takes over different roles over time, and sometimes we have more and sometimes we have less control over that. The other part that comes with a board is always giving up autonomy, and so I think I do want to touch upon this thing, which is like in each of these cases, you start the company, like it's your idea. And in most of our cases here at Lab Central, our founders start these companies. It's not frequent, it's not even the norm that the founder is still part of the team or is still in a senior position of the team after several rounds of financing or after the organization matures. Nina, I know that you recruited your successor in Seeding Labs and you're no longer the CEO there, you've moved on. Can you tell us a little bit about what made you decide that and how you came up with that decision and how it feels now?
Yeah, I'll give it a shot. There were a lot of factors that went into it, and it was a decision that really happened gradually over years. And it was a combination of a lot of different things. You alluded to this idea of being a founder and autonomy and things like that. I think for better and for worse, my experience anyway, being the founder of something, your identity and the identity of the company get real blurred, right? I had a lot of people say to me over many years, uncountable times, Seeding Labs is Nina and Nina is Seeding Labs. And while in some ways that's extraordinarily flattering, right? It can really go to your head, but it's also can be incredibly burdensome in a way, right? Because when do you get to just be you? When are you not the face of the company? It's it's a big thing to carry all day, every day of your life. And so eventually, right, that's part of what, to me, part of the decision-making was, I kind of want to be Nina and figure out who that gets to be next, independent of Seeding Labs. I also wanted to solve new intellectual challenges, right? I ran the company 5 years sort of in stealth mode, so to speak, 11 years as the CEO. That's a really long time to be solving fundamentally a lot of the same challenges, although obviously at scale, it changes all the time. But I wanted to do new things. I wanted to learn new things, right? It's amazing to be the CEO, but you also can't really get promoted to do anything new. And ironically, your job gets smaller the more successful the company is, right? I got to do less and less of the things that I originally loved when I started it. So all of those went into it. It was incredibly hard nonetheless. And now it's been nearly 2 years, I guess, since I really formally that happened. And I think I finally have started to sort of dissociate my identity from the organization in a very real way. I don't, it feels very different than it did originally. It was quite hard to step away. But it's also incredibly gratifying to be able to build something that lives without you, right? That's certainly, it's like being a parent. It's what you want for the company.
Isn't it very interesting that you describe the role of the CEO as the organization grows, becoming narrower? And I think in a way that's the outcome of a good CEO who recruits a capable team to take on tasks that the CEO, the founder, would typically initially have executed themselves. Ulrich, in our world of venture funded companies, of course, oftentimes the choice is not the one of the founder. In fact, oftentimes investors end up forcing the founder out. You've been a player in the industry now for a long time, and you've experienced some of this yourself. You've seen many peers. What is some advice that you have for other founders who are worried about this moment that, oh my God, if I take this money on, then the board will have control and they can force me out? Is there any good way of thinking about this?
Yeah, I mean, I think you want to stay in charge of your own destiny, right? I had a coach that became a very dear friend, executive coach that became a very dear friend for a long time, and she used to tell me, if you're doing something you're not passionate about anymore, you should stop doing it and have someone else do it. And it sort of became a little bit my guiding principle. You want to be excited about something that you're doing, and that's what originally had me leave Merrimack. It was becoming a commercial stage company. I was passionate about building new things, and it just, there was no room for that anymore. And I had to leave to do that. And that sort of repeated itself over the years in other businesses as well. You sort of mature them, you take them to a certain level, and then, to do new things, you usually have to leave what you're already doing. So I've tried to be more involved in the process of actually designing what happens next, after you leave. So when I left Merrimack, I was asked to join the board, which was kind of cool. It was a public company, give me some additional exposure and experience. We had Michael Porter was the head of our executive committee, and we had the head of the audit committee used to run one of the top 5 accounting firms, and there was a huge opportunity to learn there. And so I embraced that, and as a way to stay in touch, but continue to learn as well. It's very hard too, though, because you're no longer making the decisions day to day, and being sort of involved, but not being in charge is incredibly hard. I think it's a mix, do you stay involved or not? So I'm on a couple of boards now in companies that I've helped found, right? And sort of stepped away from, but I've also completely walked away from one. I don't know which one is the better solution, but either way, I think sort of making those decisions yourselves about, when do you contribute the most to the company? Are you the right person to, say, take the company public? And even if you are, do you want to? Because that's a whole different gig than you sign up for when you're building a startup.
Yeah, I think it's this. We have these discussions frequently with founders who are resisting the next growth step of their company because they're worried that they might not then grow fast enough with the company. It's very hard to develop the right answer for that, because as Nina described, they so self-identify. We all so self-identify with the company that we started. We are getting to the point where I'm getting on my screen here the questions from the audience. So before we go there, I did one of the questions that is very important for me to ask of both of you, because I know that both of you have kids, is how in this world where you start the company, where the company is an extension of your own vision and you really live and breathe the ideas of the company and vice versa, how do you still balance that with a healthy family life? And how do you take priorities, or do you just have to shove one thing to the side? And I want to ask that of both of you. I know Ulrich, I know some of your kids, they play with ours, so they certainly have a healthy family life. But how do you balance these two competing interests? Is there any good advice that you can give to young parents who also want to start a company? Is it even feasible?
I'm happy to take a go at that. It's not something I've thought a lot about. I've had an extremely understanding wife over the years, but mostly it's kind of figured itself out. I'm very passionate about my family and I love spending time with them. And, you know, if there's an opportunity to do that, I usually find a way to do it. And then you sort of push work to another time. Of course, with the whole COVID situation, our lives have gotten even more, you know, intermingled with family life, and for the better and for the worse. So I'm still learning, but so far it hasn't been a challenge for me.
Great. Nina, how have you found a good way to balance the intensity of being a founder and that of being a mom?
I appreciate that you asked both of this question, because I think it very often only gets asked of the women. I found it very difficult in some ways and not in others, right? I think the reality of having a child, especially when they're an infant, you literally don't have a choice, right? You can't not pay attention to them, particularly if you're the mom physically, right? And so in a way, I was forced to have work-life balance in a way I never actually managed to achieve without a kid. But on the other hand, what I ultimately found was that sort of emotional challenge of, right, in many ways, Seeding Labs was my first child. And if I found it very difficult to extricate myself from that relationship sufficiently all the time to be the parent that I wanted to be. And so I think that was actually part of my decision to step down, was that I didn't know if there was a way that I could do it without severing one of those relationships. To be really honest about it.
Yeah. Good choice, Nina.
Thanks.
I have a bunch of questions here that are coming in from the audience. Let's pick one here. I think let's ask this one of Ulrich. The question is, how do you approach the question of pivot versus persevere as an entrepreneur? Oftentimes, I think the question is, if you're running into a problem with your current game plan, do you say, stop, we have to find a new way, or how do you push through? Is there any, have you faced such situations? Are there some examples where you've solved this conundrum, this fork in the road?
Yeah, no, you know, you've seen that up close with me as a board member. I think I always have a plan B, right? And you're doing some of that in the background always. You know, what if the technology doesn't work? Is there an alternative way of doing it? And you work on it sort of at a low level. Done that across a few different companies, and sometimes it's come into play, you know, and it's been really important to have had a plan B, not a complete pivot, right? Just another way of going about it. In other settings, we made sure that we build more of a pipeline, you know, so you have, you know, like at Merrimack, our lead molecule failed, but we had, you know, 5 other ones in development. That's one way to do it. You know, investors don't like that so much anymore. So both some of the plan B and some of the sort of pipeline planning, you kind of have to do on your own time, because there's not room for that within sort of how they think about the 4 walls of your company. Obviously, you can only do that to a certain point when you're starting to invest in them, and it becoming costly, and then you sort of start to more formally talk about those plans. But that's been my approach to it.
because the science risk is so inherent in all we do, and you have to be prepared for it not going linearly.
Right.
Yeah, yeah. There's the next question for you, Nina. As you recruit your initial team, what are the qualities that you're looking for in the candidates?
Yes, I had a lot of very stringent criteria that you could not really put into a job description. Because I think what I found and I found this even as the company grew, was that there were these sort of qualities of risk-taking, of the ability to be a person who pivots, and creative and proactive, that were more important than a resume. And so how sort of interviewing to suss those out turned into it was a very challenging thing I find that interviewing can be just as hard as being interviewed, if not harder. But that was above all what I was looking for, sort of much more than particular academic experience or specific job roles. Was really, I wanted people who were going to not sort of wait for instruction, who were going to be problem solvers, who were going to figure out how to pivot, who weren't going to get wedded to a solution. And, and ultimately, I really believed in that strategy to the end. That was always the most important characteristics of finding people.
So you mentioned character or characteristics. Talk to some of them. What are they that make for a good team member in an entrepreneurial founding team? You mentioned risk taking. What others are there?
Yeah. There's a real, you asked Julie about pivoting, and I think that's huge. And I think particularly in an organization like ours that was mission focused. This is why I really believe in starting with a problem and not a solution or a technology, because we had to be adapting and changing all the time, but we had that sort of North Star that we were always guiding towards. And so, I wanted a team of people who believed in that end vision, who understood it and saw it the way that I did, and who were, sort of not going to say, but this is how we've always done it, or this is how it's always done, right? And who were going to say, well, no one's ever done this before, and I'm it. So let me figure out how to do this. and that sort of, and building a real team around that, right? Like the real sort of esprit de corps that was necessary for everybody to feel like they were part of solving one thing. No territoriality, not going to fight about who's going to get credit for it. We just figure out the problem.
Do we need in science entrepreneurial companies? Is that so, like, there's this myth of the entrepreneur solving the world's biggest problems. Now you two are big problem-solving entrepreneurs, but let me challenge you with this question and say, isn't entrepreneurship overhyped in our world? What do we really need this for? Ulrich, go first.
It's a great question, right? But if you ever worked in a large organization trying to do new things, you know exactly why, right? It becomes very hard. And I saw this even at Merrimack, right? As a 300 people organization, turning commercial, trying to do new things became impossible, because you're so focused on, exploiting what you already have in hand. I smirk a little bit at this question too in Cambridge, because the sort of the entrepreneurs, as I think about them, they're becoming a little bit of a dying breed. More and more companies are founded by venture capital groups, and entrepreneurs are hired. And some of those are very good entrepreneurs, but they didn't sort of, quit their job, go without a pay for 6 months, while they're licensing the technology, right, to make it happen. So it's a little bit different breed. It'll be interesting to see how this plays out. At Lab Central, we see a mix of those, and it's fun to watch. But I have such fascination for the real entrepreneurs, and I wouldn't even call myself that, but you literally have people who quit their jobs, have no income, and paying rent at Lab Central, right, to make their idea happen, and it's fun to watch.
I think that's a little bit how Nina got her start, right? You didn't have a venture capitalist writing you a $10 million check when you got started.
Most definitely not. No, I had 2 years of funding, $30,000 each year. That's what I started Seeding Labs with. Very glamorous. I think
the question was, do we need entrepreneurs, and what do we need them for if we have capable government?
I think we do need entrepreneurs. I think the myth of entrepreneurs is what's dangerous. The mythology is the problem, I think, not the act of being an entrepreneur, which I do agree with, is incredibly necessary. You've got to have people who say, well, why can't we do it differently? Or no one's ever done this before, and who get excited by that phrase. Because I definitely know people who get scared by that phrase, and we need both kinds. But I think what has become this kind of this sort of dangerous area is this all-encompassing sort of mythologizing of the entrepreneur, right? And this, I've heard this certainly from funders in sort of the social enterprise space that, oh, what do you look for in an investment? We look for the founder and the charisma of the founder. And I think that's dangerous for investors. I think it's extremely detrimental to the entrepreneurs themselves, right? Because it fosters a lot of the problems that you see sort of at the extreme ends of, founders who won't leave or can't change, or, right, all sorts of personality cults and things like that we can allude to. But I also think it's an incredible burden that you place on entrepreneurs to be the end all be all of their company, because at the end of the day, it should be bigger than them.
Right. Then it then starts defining their personality to be the head of this company. Is that what you describe as the myth of entrepreneurship?
Yeah, I think it's this, right? It's this one charismatic leader who, right, and everything rises and falls on them, and they are the company, and the company is them. I think, I think it leads down a path that is ultimately a little problematic for everybody involved.
In the same context, I've seen you take a rare career move, Nina, which is really the exception. Many times we see people from big corporations move and become a founder, or from academia. We rarely see it going the other way. I don't want you to get in trouble with your employer, but how's it going? What are the things that you're giving up? What are the things that you're gaining? And should we think of this more as a two-way street?
I think that having had a foot in both worlds, it's an incredible vantage point to know how to talk to people in these different worlds. I find that, right, and this was one of the reasons that I wanted to make this move, and it absolutely has been, above all, an anthropological experience, for sure. But, right, I find that a lot of people in big companies have never been entrepreneurs and don't really understand the bind that people in startups are in, or how to really talk to them. And vice versa. People in startups, we didn't know how to talk to people in large companies. We didn't know what was on their mind and keeping them up at night. And in some cases, you really speak mutually incomprehensible languages. And I wanted to be fluent in both. And so that was really my goal. And it is at very different worlds. And you do give some things up. I will say, right, there's an incredible freedom to not having to be the one upon whom payroll rests every 2 weeks. But at the same time, there are things you can't do in a large company. So and things that you have unbelievable resources at your disposal to do that you can't dream of in a startup. So there's pros and cons to both. And I love that idea of being able to move in both worlds.
That's great. We will welcome you back in this world once you've learned enough on the big corporate side. Now, with 1 minute left, for closing statements, maybe we want to leave the audience with a recommendation from your experience. If you were to talk to a grad student now who's halfway through their PhD and who are thinking to quit their program because they have this fantastic idea, they want to build a cancer drug, Ulrich, how would you sit down with a person like that who asks advice of you, and what would you leave them with?
I mean, we're drug addicts, right? We're happy to lure them into our world. Of course, you say just do it, but I also tell people that, and we have these conversations a lot, especially when people join early stage companies, to help build them. What can you do? What's your plan B? And What I tell people is that you can always go and work for a big company, and very often they see you having taken risks and done these types of things as a sort of proof of leadership, and want to hire you. And I've seen a few people go that path into large organizations and doing a really good job. And Nina is an example of that too.
Thank you. Nina, do you have parting advice for our audience? Think of that young grad student that was you 10, 15 years ago. What would you tell her today?
Well, I did consider whether I should finish my PhD or not. And I'm glad that I did. It wasn't my favorite, 6 years of my life per se, in some ways. But what I learned through doing that is invaluable. And the credibility that you get by having those letters after your name matters, right? Not to mention the sort of flexibility to be employable in other places that Uli alluded to. It mattered that I could introduce myself with that background when talking to partners, investors, all kinds of people. It took me more seriously, and I had a bridge to our customers as well, because we had that in common. So I do think it's very, very useful. And I do think that empirical science trains you to think and solve problems in a way that's helpful in every area of life, no matter what you do with it afterwards. And you can always do something with it.
Very good. Well, thank you both so much for your participation in this short web seminar this afternoon. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. I'm sure that the audience did. And I look forward to having you all back. We will continue this series. I don't think we have a date yet for the new year, but please do stay tuned, and you will hear from Lab Central about the next and upcoming webinar series. Thank you again to Nina and Ulrich, and happy holidays, Merry Christmas to all of you. See you next year. Bye-bye.